Alright, guys. So, I wanted to make a relatively short, but somewhat informative video about growing orchids and other plants in general. Although orchids are a little bit less tolerant of certain cultural mistakes, if you will. And I just wanted to briefly go over a couple of factors that people should keep in mind when they want to know how often they should water, fertilize, what kind of light they should give, things like that. Um, because I know a lot of people want to be formulaic about it and, have a set frequency for doing one thing or another, and that's not the best way to go about it. It does work if you have a couple of orchids, or if your collection is incredibly large and kept in a very controlled environment, and you're growing things that are relatively easy and tolerant of things such as overwatering or temperature swings or what have you. But if you really want to get good diversity in your collection and you want to, grow things that aren't just grocery store orchids, no offense to the people who really enjoy the Phalaenopsis and the occasional Oncidium intergeneric, and well, I like the Oncidiums, but you go to a grocery store and it's usually Phalaenopsis. Maybe Paphiopedilum is there every now and then. Maybe you'll see Dendrobium or Oncidium, but it's almost always Phalaenopsis. Let's be honest here. Like, you're not going to go to the grocery store and see Cattleyas or Epidendrums or any of the really exotic Dendrobiums or any of the Bulbophyllum or any of those things. But whatever. Um, One of the things that people want is frequency of watering and how much light to administer, when to fertilize, this and that. Um, and it's important to kind of gauge what's going on rather than having a set period or schedule for something. It might be to your advantage to just keep an eye on how things are going. Err on the side of underwatering. That's what I generally do because it's much easier to correct for. If you overwater and roots rot, you have to protect the plant until it regrows roots. Sometimes you can't do that, and sometimes you have to give the plant like a special humidity chamber. Some people just rig up a bag and some wet moss or something so that the leaves don't dry out completely while the plant sends out new roots. Um, Sometimes you'll get rot or disease and things like that if you overwater. If you underwater, your plant might be a little bit dehydrated, but as long as you're not underwatering for extended periods of time, you're not going to have any irreversible damage done. So usually when I start out, I have an every other week rule. Um, Generally, especially if it's winter time, I won't water things more often than every other week. Although the house I'm living in now is a little bit drier than where I've lived before, so it's usually more every 11 or 12 days I water now, just because things dry up a little bit more quickly. You have to keep in mind there are many factors involved with how quickly something dries up. Now, we're going to start with our epiphytic orchids, and then we're going to talk a little bit about terrestrials. And remember, you can probably apply this to a lot of other plants, and there are orchids from all different areas of the world. So right now we're just gonna stick with the tropical epiphytes that everybody loves and that everybody's familiar with. If you're in a house, plants will use up media, well, the water in their media or soil or whatever, at a rate that is proportional to the sorry, somebody just texted me, and I'll read it later. In a rate that's proportional to their photosynthetic output. Um, and photosynthesis is a metabolic process that plants undergo. I think there's a fly in my window. Give me a. It's not alive, but it was like dead inside of like the little pane, so it looked like it was just like sticking there. But anyway, um, photosynthesis obviously is the process by which plants use light to produce sugars, and they basically do that by having light strike the water in the cells, which basically releases water. And of course, it is way more complicated than that. There are several chain reactions that occur between the sun hitting the leaf and water escaping the leaf. Do not get the impression that the only thing that happens is water is split and escapes the leaf. But basically, the more a plant is photosynthesizing and the more metabolism is going on inside of that plant leaf, the more water the leaf is losing. And when that happens, the root has to pull in more water. And so, if you have a plant that is in very warm temperatures, and I don't mean like fatally hot, but like warmer than 65 to 70, you're going to have higher respiration, higher metabolism, higher water loss. If they're if the plant is getting a decent amount of sun, it's going to lose more water. And it's not just because of the sun heating up the plant and the soil, which will pull water away faster. It's also the sun is allowing for more photosynthetic activity to occur at any given point of time, which means the amount of water that's used up and removed from the plant increases. And the relative humidity of the air around the plant. The drier the air is, because water diffuses, basically, if you have an area of low concentration of anything, and this is not just sugars in liquids, water vapor in air is the same way. If you have a wet soil and really dry air, as time goes on, the water in that soil has a higher affinity for the dry air because naturally systems reach equilibrium where the amount of water present in the air will tend to be equal to the amount of water in the soil. So if you have really dry air, you're going to have a much more rapid rate of evaporation from that soil relative to more humid air. So if you're living in a warm, dry, sunny spot, you're going to lose water from your orchids a lot more quickly than if you're in a cool, shady, humid area. And obviously, these are independent variables, and if they're all combined together at their highest, you're going to have the highest water loss. Give me a sec. But you really just want to, get a feel for what kind of media you're using. If you're using epiphytic media, I generally have bark mixed with the clay balls that they sell for hydroponics. And have a general idea of how quickly water dissipates. It will dissipate from the surface within several hours, but it takes at least 5 or 6 days for the entire pot to dry out. And I'll generally, just to play it safe, allow the pot to be dry for a few days after that. So, if the plant is outside, maybe 3 or 4 days between waterings. And if the plant is inside, it can be anywhere, depending on the size of the pot. There's also the principle of surface area. So if you have a really, really small pot, there is more surface area of your media for water to dissipate from, so you're going to lose water more quickly than if you have a very, very large pot where you have, this very center core, if you will, of your pot that doesn't really get much airflow or water movement or anything. So when water gets in there, it's trapped there. It's basically the reason our cells are so small is so that things can go in and out through the membrane and reach any particular part of the cell at any given time. So if you have a very large pot, you're not going to have to water as often. What I generally do is that greenhouse that I showed you guys in my previous video, that is very humid in there, so things don't dry up very quickly. I can go 3 weeks without watering some of those things in there, and they do fine. It's not horribly warm. Water kind of stays put, and you don't want to overwater them because also you'll encourage fungus gnats if you have really excessively wet soil. And so you have to take that into consideration. If you have very large particle, less organic material soil or media, you're going to have much lower water retention. That's another factor. The best rule of thumb would be to keep some bamboo skewers or even not mechanical, but the wooden pencils on hand, and kind of jam it into the middle of the media, every few days after watering to see when there's no more color change, which indicates the middle of that soil is wet. You do want epiphyte media to dry almost entirely between waterings because you want air to get back in there and hit those roots because those roots are actively respiring. They need airflow, otherwise they will suffocate. And if you just continually inundate them with water without allowing airflow to get hit them and you don't allow gastric exchange to occur, you're going to have those roots dying in several weeks to several months, and then you're going to lose your orchid. And unfortunately, people don't notice this until it's too late because the roots can take a little bit of excessive moisture, but once you've gone several months where you're just continually keeping it wet, you start to see the roots being killed off, and then it's too late. So it's really important to just kind of keep an eye on what's going on. If the plant looks like the leaves are shriveling, but it doesn't really seem that parts of it are like soft and mushy, it's probably underwatered. As far as fertilizers go, you'll probably want to fertilize, I'd say, once a month. That's what I do. Some of my more rapid growing things, like my cymbidiums, that need a lot more fertilizer, I'll fertilize every few weeks, especially when they're outside during the summer. I actually fertilize the cymbidiums with tomato fertilizer. Um, and some of it just takes going on the internet, reading multiple resources, seeing what other people do, talking to people who have done it, um, learning about where the species comes from. Terrestrial species are a little bit easier. Most terrestrial species, unless they're like high altitude temperate things that have a dry winter, like the Pleione orchids, which I'm getting some of in a few weeks, um, should be kept totally dry during the winter. I water most of my things less during the winter, partially because there really isn't much respiration or metabolic activity going on. And most terrestrials can will appreciate being consistently moist. You don't have to worry. As long as the soil's not sodden, maybe you allow the top few millimeters of soil to get that light dry color before you water it again. Um, my ludicias are in media that will kind of like, yeah, like a little bit of a whitish coating. I think it's just the salts from the water I use the tap water, and it doesn't seem to hurt them in any way, but it does leave a deposit. So once that surface layer of water is gone, you see that salt that had been sitting in that water left over. And that's kind of an indicator that, yeah, that soil is starting to get dry. Um, there are all sorts of things. People sell aqua globes if you're really having a problem. As far as lighting goes, um, obviously, orchid leaves that have red color to them are probably getting too much light. That's easy to fix, just put in a more shaded location. As far as getting enough light, plant the orchids like the oncidiums and their allies, and the dendrobiums, the epidendrums, the cattleyas. These are really, really high light loving orchids. And then you have orchids like Phalaenopsis that can tolerate quite a low amount of light. And then you have things like jewel orchids and Paphiopedilums and other things that are terrestrials that really don't appreciate a lot of light. You should know how much light your things need. Cymbidiums also appreciate a lot of light. And what I'll do with those guys is I'll keep them outside in full sun during the summer. And what will sometimes happen is I'll put them out, and then some of their leaves will burn off because it's too bright for them. Then they'll grow new leaves back and everything will be fine. But then I'll bring them back inside in the wintertime, and then they'll be like, oh, we don't have enough light. And then their leaves will like elongate too much and get weird colors, and they'll eniolate a little bit and whatever. And then I put them back outside in the spring, and the cycle repeats. It's always fun. LED bulbs are really good, especially if you get the daylight color, not like the weird red or white or whatever. Daylight gives you the entire. Well, I think white light would be fine too. That's what I use, daylight and white light. As long as you're not like getting the yellow or some of the like weird colors, you get the full like electromagnetic spectrum that the plant needs. And LED emits a lot of light. Lighting is usually measured in lumens, but 1 lumen is equal to 1 foot candle. Generally, on the internet, they'll say this orchid needs, 3,000 foot candles of light or whatever. And so a foot candle is equal to a lumen. So I get the You can go to Job Lot, Costco, any of the discount stores that are around your area, and they'll sell, really inexpensive LED lights. LED lights use very little energy. They are high light emission, so they're very efficient bulbs. They release a lot of light for very little energy. They're inexpensive. They last a very long time. They're very good bulbs. That's what I use. They also sell like I have a string of LED bulbs. I have LED work lamps. I have a whole bunch of things. I'm like hoarding LED bulbs. There's a problem. I need an intervention. No, I'm kidding about that. But I do have a whole bunch of LED bulbs and LED supplies so that I can illuminate things during the winter time. And I've had plants burn under LED lights, and I've had things need more than the LED lights. So you kind of just have to keep an eye on things. If the plant looks like, the leaves are kind of dulling out, or maybe parts of the plant are like kind of getting really spindly or elongated, it probably doesn't have enough light. And obviously, if you have access to some kind of greenhouse that stays warm, then utilize that. Um, and that's about it. Um, I think that covers the majority of it. Maybe I'll make a follow up to this if there are other things that people want me to address.